to record. And all right. Everyone, welcome to the How to Write a Book podcast. I am so excited to meet with author, writer, development editor, ghostwriter, book coach, Josh Kelley. Josh, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. I'm really happy to be here.
Me too. You know, just reading your bio, going over your book, your message is inspirational, and especially kind of like your interesting story and your background. I mean, a little bit of just everything. So before we kind of dive into your writing, your process, and everything about you, I'll give a little bit about you for our listeners in case they don't know who you are yet. So Josh Kelley is a pastor, bartender, and adjunct, or has been an adjunct biblical studies professor. You are a traditionally published author of Radically Normal, Harvest House, novelist, writing coach, developmental editor, and ghostwriter. And you love communicating life-changing truths in an engaging way and helping others do the same, which is something that we do in the podcast.
Yeah.
And even more about you is that you've been married for over 20 years. You have two teenage daughters, and you've spent 8 months driving around the country in a minivan, saw 40 states, 2 provinces, and Tijuana.
Yep.
Wow. Oh my gosh.
Yeah, that was quite a trip. So kind of the story behind that is, I was a pastor for about 15 years. And then we had to close my church, which, sometimes that happens. It shrunk down to where it just wasn't, just didn't make any sense to continue. And, so like many people, we always joked about driving around the country. And at that point, it's like, what do we have to lose? So it's a little more to it than that, but we kind of packed up our girls in the minivan, drove around. At that point, my first book, Radically Normal, just come out. And, you think that if you get a traditional publisher, like all your dreams are going to come true and it's all going to be awesome. And so I, was very excited. We're going to go do kind of a book tour and speak at churches and speak at, do signings or whatever. And there's a little bit of that, but more than anything, that trip ended up being more of a sabbatical for me. After 15 years at one, being a pastor, I was really ready for that. But it was an amazing thing. I mean, it's hard to comprehend how big and how diverse this country is. So I'm in the Northwest and you're in SoCal, right?
Yeah. So good.
Yeah, so actually, you're not terribly far from Montebello, right?
Yeah, I think just a couple.
Yeah, that's where my great grandparents. Was that?
Oh, yeah, just a couple of minutes, not minutes, but a couple hours. I mean, right? Yeah, but yeah.
So, anyways, I actually did my undergrad down that area. My family's kind of from that area. I had my great grandparents lived in Montebello down there. I think just kind of in that area and. So that to say, traveling the country is really cool. It's a great perspective. But I came back from that and just really didn't want to be a pastor anymore. I mean, being pastor, I enjoyed it, but it's not the sort of job you do because for the money. There's plenty of jobs. If you're just out there and need to earn a check, that's great. Nothing wrong with that. But you don't want a counselor, you don't want a pastor, you don't want some of these politicians to be doing it for the money, right? And so at that point, but what I really realized, I love to write, and that's what I wanted to do. And as a pastor, I did a lot of writing as well as having my book published. So I became a bartender instead, and which was a lot of fun. I really did enjoy bartending. And during that time, about 5 years, I wrote my novel, which I got finished. I've been trying to shop it around. Haven't had great luck with it. That's, that happens a lot. But then COVID came along, and that kind of changed everything pretty substantially for a lot of us in the just for the entire country. But, over the past several months, I've used that to kind of pivot away from the service industry into now being a full-time freelance ghostwriter, developmental editor. And we can talk later, if people want to know kind of what the different types of editing are. And I'm starting to make a living at it. Certainly being a freelancer, it's a little scary. But I've had some great contracts, and so I've been able to work with a couple of great people, and so that's kind of, I guess, the short bio.
That is awesome. And you know what? You probably know more about LA than I do, because I'm actually from NorCal. So then I just recently moved. So
gotcha.
yeah. So
we're in NorCal.
Close to San Jose, so like Hollister, that we're like
Okay.
known for like the greatest biker rally. In before COVID times, that used to be a thing. So in that area, so just recently moved down to
Gotcha.
LA just a couple like literally weeks ago. So you know the map way more than I do. So
I won't ask you any trick questions then about In-N-Out Burger and, you know, on which locations and all that, right?
right, right. Or and people are already asking me like, oh, like, so is it the I-5 or just I-5? And I'm like, oh gosh, where am I going? Because there's the SoCal slang and the NorCal slang, and I'm
Oh
like,
gosh. That's when I did my undergrad down there. This I know is so relevant, but the thing that's so weird for me is up here, every freeway is simply known by its number. You have I-5, 405, you know, 520. That's all you call it by. And back in this day, so this is about 25 years ago that I went to college. In Southern California, they never called any freeway by the number, ever. I'm now seeing where you're starting to hear it called by that, but at the time you listen to the news, the traffic report, and so, well, okay, traffic's heavy on the Golden State Freeway. You may want to take the I can't remember the name, but you had to actually know the names of all these freeways, and they had names like from here to here would be this name. Then once you got past this point, change the name, and I mean, it drove me crazy. But
yeah,
again,
yeah.
completely irrelevant. Just
Well, you never know,
it's
right?
funny to
There,
me.
yeah, there might be a writer out there who needs to know what highways were called a couple of years ago versus now. So it's like, all right.
Which kind of that's one of the interesting things. So the novel that I wrote takes place in roughly 1982, Southern California, Azusa actually. It's not terribly far from where my college was, and so I knew the area, and it just I don't know why, but that's where I placed it. But it involved a fair amount of research for me to find out which freeways are still where, even that amount of time ago. And you know, when it comes to research for novels, because my theory is that you're never looking for 100% accuracy. The goal is not accuracy. It's I can never pronounce this word right, but verisimilitude, verisimilitude, something like that. You know, you want it to feel real, and so that's always my goal. So there's some things I know aren't accurate, but in general, just doing that research so that my book felt accurate, and including things like whether they call freeways by names or by numbers. That's just a useful. Sometimes you have to either visit a place or else call someone from there and kind of just chat.
Yeah, and that is awesome. That's actually one of the questions I was going to ask you was research. And
Mhm.
I do want to get back to talking about, radically normal, but let's just, while we're on this topic,
Yeah.
research, and you as a development editor, you're when we go into research, sometimes it can feel like a rabbit hole, and sometimes it can feel like it's not enough. And just like you said,
Right.
verisimilitude, like where's like the line in that? Like, well, how do you know if you're in the sweet spot?
You know, there's a certain extent to which, for me, now, of course, every person is very different.
Mm.
And so the way I'm wired, ADHD, dyslexia, I'm great at taking a ton of information. That's what makes me a good developmental editor is I can very quickly read a lot of stuff and keep it all in my head and then kind of help organize it. But I suck with details. So you never want me I could proofread your book, but it's going to be painful for me and I'm going to miss a lot of stuff. But so for me, but I'm also a naturally curious person.
Mhm.
And so there's an extent to where I let them just kind of follow my fancy. The trick is, I think, is I understand what mode I'm in. When I'm in solid writing time, we all know how hard it is to get to that spot where your words are flying and you're in the groove. The worst thing you can do is to be in a groove and then interrupt it to research something.
Right.
So in my mind, I have a couple different, modes, so to speak, writing, editing, research. And at my best, I will write, I'll come to something and instead of like, oh, I need to look that up. I won't, when I'm behaving, when I'm doing the right thing, I'll just jot a note and just put like a, research here note in my manuscript. And then in the afternoon, so mornings are when I write best. So I'm always going to do any interviews, anything like that in the afternoons. So what I did, I would then come back where I'm in kind of that unproductive time where I'm a little more I'm more likely kind of click my way around the internet and just kind of let it go. And sometimes I'll find out some detail that's just like, well, I'll be darned, man, I never thought of that. And so again, that's why I say about in terms of letting your fancy, I just follow my fancy
Mhm.
and just take notes. And I don't know if I'm going to use it. I may or may not. This is something from years of being a pastor. For me, it'd be common for me to skim, when I'm getting ready to write a sermon, skim about 100 pages worth of material, commentaries, biblical studies, other sermons. and then kind of choose the best, like 10 pages worth of those notes, and then go write my own with all that in my head. But it's kind of, you have to kind of know, almost sometimes maybe it's giving yourself a time limit. You know, it's going to vary for each person. But the trick is, I think, is to make sure you schedule your time so you're not giving yourself unending research time. Did that answer the question? I'm not sure. I kind of went a lot of places.
Yeah, it did. And actually, I think that ties in a lot to a theme that we have going on this month within the podcast, which is kind of following your muse, or like you said, your fancy, and kind of knowing like where you're strong at and what times of days that you're actually like really on versus off. So totally, I think that that's going to really resonate well with writers, especially because I think that right now we have this kind of interesting stigma that a writer should be a certain way. And we're trying to like develop like, hey, you know, you could be this kind of writer or this kind of writer or this kind of writer. And every writer's different, and just kind of like exploring and trying to find that. And
it really is a big thing of know thyself. You know, you have to really be a student of yourself and know how you work. So for me, I write from a coffee shop. I'm in a coffee shop right now, and they know me very well here. So for me, if I don't have a certain level of distraction, I get distracted. Home is typically the worst place for me to write. That's me. And my best times are writing in the morning or late. When my daughters went to bed earlier, I could write in the evenings a little better. But now by the time they're finally in bed, it's kind of late and I'm not going to be productive. You know.
That is,
so yeah, you just have to know yourself and work with that. There's no good beating up yourself like, oh, so-and-so does this. You know, Stephen King writes every single day except for, well, no, every single day.
Yeah.
Well, that's not you. That's okay. You don't have to do it someone else's way. You have to figure out how you work.
Yeah, totally. I totally get that. And I understand that. I think that's super great that you said that, because it's literally what we're talking about in this month's podcast. Yeah. And so based between the two books, because you have the Christian book, then you have the non-Christian book, did you find like you were working differently, or because you kind of know yourself, maybe you had similar patterns of writing? What did you discover?
Well, because the second book, the novel, because it was a novel, that did make it a very, very different thing. And I had to kind of teach myself how to write fiction. It's actually, I was reading one agent who said that in his experience, very few nonfiction writers transition well into fiction because there's such different things. The purpose of nonfiction is typically to tell. The purpose of fiction is typically to show. You know, show don't tell, right? And I took that quote of his and pasted it on the top of my document, and so I always kept on coming back to it. So it's more than, Christian versus non-Christian. It was more just the type of stuff I was writing. You're going to change your language based upon what your audience. So like if you know that the people you're talking to are writers, you're going to talk a certain way. I actually, with my first client, I made things unnecessarily complicated because I talked to her as if she were a writer, and she's not. But when you're talking to other writers, you talk a certain way. If I know my audience is largely going to be Christian, I'm going to make statements that I just expect people are going to understand. When I wrote my novel, one of my beta readers was an atheist with a PhD in psychology, and I love her perspective because there's times where within whatever your tribe is, it doesn't matter if you're talking 4-H or Muslim, Christian, writer versus, meat packer. I don't care. You have phraseology. You have things that you just assume everyone else knows.
Yeah.
And so like she'd keep on saying things like, wait, Josh, what's the difference between a evangelical and a fundamentalist again? I always think they're the same thing. Well, no, they're not. Here's well. And I realized, okay, I need to clarify this in my book because a lot of people aren't going to understand this stuff.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if I answered your question.
Oh, yeah. No, totally. And so, first the mindsets were different because of novel versus nonfiction. And, it's so interesting that your mindset shift had to change, especially with what the editor was saying. And I'm curious, so were there specific things that maybe you differently? So like say right now, like you're in the coffee shop, did those like small habits change between the two books?
With writing, first of all, when I write nonfiction, I'm still using a lot of stories because stories work.
Yeah.
I don't need to try and sell you on that. Just stories work for communicating truth.
Yeah.
Or communicating information. So even like with my nonfiction, I remember at one point once I got through a certain level, like my third draft or whatever it is, I would just like do a red line along in the margins wherever there wasn't a story. And I would just flip through and say, oh wait, this red line is too long. It's time for a story, and add a story. So that's to say storytelling is already, I get its power. Mm-hmm. But being a novelist, you definitely have to be more playful. Mm-hmm. You have to really pursue much more of a what if. And I think John Cleese did this really great thing about creativity. And I know he is borrowing someone else's research, but basically talking about these modes of editing versus creativity, open and closed, basically. And when you're in that open mindset, you're just letting everything run, and then close is when you're, okay, you've got your ideas, now you're dealing with them and you're implementing them. Fiction writing is going to involve a lot of that open, what if, and just allowing things to play. Mm-hmm. I think when it comes to developing fiction, that's something that's so different from person to person. So for me, I'm not, use the term outliner versus pantser, or, outliner versus organic writer. I'm definitely organic. I remember, on Facebook writing one day that today I'm writing the scene where my female protagonist meets up with her black sheep little sister, and I can't wait to write it so I can find out what happens. Oh, so cool. I walked to it that day, no clue. I knew they're going to meet up at In-N-Out Burger on Grand Avenue in Azusa. Nice. That's all I knew, and I just couldn't wait to find out. But that's how I function. But I do think that when it comes to novel writing, you just have to have a playfulness.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. And I might be biased because I am also a pantser, right? So right. I'm like, oh yeah, let's just find out what's going to happen. And I love it. It's fun, It
is, but you end up miswriting a lot of stuff because you don't always know where you're going.
Exactly. You're like, oh, that one dark cave that I went down, never mention it again. Just gonna have to do something else with it or throw it away or something.
Yep.
And that's amazing. And that's such a great answer to that question because, we do get a lot of questions on the podcast that people are just struggling again, like with this idea of they have to write a certain way. They have to show up a certain way. And if they don't do it that way, then they're messing up. They're quote unquote messing up. Right.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. And I love what you've said here, which is, not only are you getting to know yourself, and that has its own nuances, but also between your two different, books, that took two different types of thinking and approaches. And that's totally normal.
Yeah. And it's always changing, and, you're kind of, and you have to really give yourself permission that early on you're figuring out how to do things. Mm-hmm. And yeah, you really have to have a lot of grace with yourself. I think back to some of the earlier stuff I wrote, and I read, it's like, oh man, that's so bad. Man, there's exposition all over the place, and I'm telling, not showing, and all this stuff. But it's where I started. Mm-hmm. And of course, this is where it comes in. Then you get into this later stuff about having beta readers, editing, killing your darlings, and all that stuff. That's absolutely vital. Mm-hmm. But you never want to start there. You have all of Anne Lamott's shitty first draft, how important that is. If you can't write crap, if you can't just give yourself permission to go wander wherever, you're never gonna have anything that's any good.
Right. And for those listeners who don't know Anne Lamott's book, Bird by Bird, right? Right. That one talks about that first draft and just having at it and giving yourself, like you said, that grace of saying, you have to work with something. So no matter how terrible it sounds at first, at least you have something.
Yeah.
Excellent.
And it was so interesting in that, I think is in that book, she said that it's not unusual to end up writing something and the thing that even inspired you to write in the first place ends up getting cut, and that's what happened with my novel. My whole opening, the whole place the thing started, the conversation that started it, one day I just realized I had to cut it, and okay, there it goes. Really? But you don't do that until later in the process. During, you have to, again, it's playful versus work. You have to kind of go back and forth,
Yeah. So what was your initial inspiration? And then at the end of your book, how did that inspiration change or morph into what the end result was?
Basically, for so many authors, and this isn't all by any means, but you hear several authors who say that a novel starts with a picture, some sort of mental image. For C.S. Lewis, it was seeing a lonely lamp in a snowy forest and a fawn. That's how Lionel Lynch and the Wardrobe started. And you have these different people say, this is the story, this is the picture. For me, it's a picture of a washed up or a disgraced pastor working as a bartender. And that was really, that's how it started. Now, at that point, I was working as a former pastor, working as a bartender, but I hadn't had an affair. I hadn't done any of the bad things that my character had done. But it's just an interesting, what would this look like? And then just from there, it really wasn't playfulness. I didn't have any story. I just had this image of this guy. And then I say, well, what if his son, the son he didn't know he has walks into his bar? Well, that'd be interesting. Let's write that. Let's see what happens. And then I just kept on trying things. And the concept's all still there, but the nature of the story changed quite a bit.
Wow, that's awesome. And this is the book that you're currently still pitching out there, right?
Yep. Yeah, exactly.
That is awesome.
And like, in terms of like, and I don't know how helpful this is, but I guess this has to do with the kind of openness you need to have. It started as one book. You have this opening scene with the pastor realizes that this kid is a son, and just drops some expletives and kind of takes off. And then I end up coming back to like 32 years later, where he earlier, where he first meets the girl that becomes his wife. Oh. And then the more I wrote, the more I started writing. I was doing third person POV because that's just what works for me, but close third person POV. Then I realized as I started to interact with this girl who had become his wife, Leah, I realized I really like this gal. In fact, I think I like her better than I like Dave. And so it made her become a POV character too. So now I have two POVs. And so I'm writing their story. And initially I was just going to try and get through the earlier part of the relationship fairly quickly, then move on to, where I'd started. Then the book turned into 2 books because I realized there's too much of a story to be told. And then it turned into 3 books, and it stopped there. But basically realizing that I have a good story to tell, and I knew what the story was, and it kept on evolving. But eventually I kind of landed on this first book is going to take from when they meet to when they get married, or shortly after they get married, because have my final conflict. And then the second book would deal with basically when things go south, and then the third book would deal with he's been off running away from her all this time later. So wow. I mean, it's a fun process. It really is. And at the points where I didn't feel pressure, I really enjoyed it. There's the other part of me. It's like, well, here I'm making my family. I have this bartending job. It's not necessarily the best for family life. It's a struggle. And so the pressure to perform both worked for and against me. Mm-hmm. In that, I was driven. I am very driven. I think some of that comes from ADHD. There's a lot of things with ADHD, especially feeling like you're never accomplishing anything. And so you feel like you have to work all the harder to get it done. That works for me in times because I am incredibly driven, but also works against me relationally because it's very hard on my wife, and we've had to really figure a lot of that stuff out. But also sometimes I didn't enjoy the fun of it and maybe as much as I should have.
That's a really good point. I think we were talking about this in an earlier episode, which is that sometimes you do find these places, you have a lot of joy in the process. And then there's these places where you're like, oh, this is really tough. Like, I kind of don't want to sit down and do this, So how did you push yourself to finish it? Because you're talking about your drive, in those moments, what were you thinking? What were you doing to say, I'm going to get it done?
I treated it as a job. So I would actually say, I'm going to write, I'm going to work now. So I would have, this time, from this time to this time on certain days, I would go and write for 3 hours. And then I would go bartend and come home. And it was my job. If you're going to be a successful writer, you have to treat your writing as a job. Yeah. Because there is always going to be something to pull you away. Mm-hmm. Always. And whether it's a well-meaning family or, a leaky gutter or whatever it is, you have to treat it like you're punching the clock. So for a while, I actually kept track of how many hours I wrote. Nice. And so I was treating it as a clock. Now, again, there were some levels of unhealth in there. This ambition that was not entirely healthy. but it got me to the place where I developed the habits. And once that habit's formed, then it becomes more natural. So that's what worked for me, but you really have to, here's one of my big theories about so many things, but writing especially, is why are you doing it? What's your purpose? Why does this matter to you? And that's one of my first questions when, you know, I'm working with authors is, why are you doing this? Why does this matter? Because if you don't have a strong reason, that you need a strong reason to carry you through the resistance. Now, if your reason is you just want to kind of have fun writing and that you enjoy doing that, that's awesome. There's nothing wrong with that. Then you can just kind of puddle along, and that's fine. But so for me, I don't think of myself as a creative first, and that sounds kind of weird to say. I think of myself as a communicator, and I use creativity to communicate. Because of that, I can be ruthless with my own editing, because it's not about my creativity. It's about saying something, about telling a story that means a lot to me. So I'm ruthless with that because I know how much it means to me. My life purpose is to communicate things I think are important. Well, number one, I'm a father, a husband, my family. Those are my relationship with God. Those are like the center of my life, although a lot of times I get unhealthy and kind of wander away from that. But professionally, communication is why I'm here. And it's that drive. And so an author needs to know, again, why they're writing. And if it's that important to them, that will keep your butt in the seat, you know, to keep on writing. And you have to keep that in front of you.
Yeah. And I think that is so important because, you know, on those downtimes, that's going to spark you and help push you forward. And so I'm curious, so regarding your clients, since you do developmental editing and you do ghostwriting, what are some of the most common reasons, the whys that you find? Oh, did I cut out?
The whys, why people write?
Yeah.
Like, it cut out for a little bit. I lost it for a little bit, but you're back.
Okay, great.
So you said, so why do I find that the people do why are they doing their writing?
Yeah. Like, so what are the most
a lot of times it's
the most common reasons? I guess there's a lag. My bad.
Yeah. I don't know. I would say for some it's a business, you know, like having a lead generating. So I'm like a buddy of mine, he has a small publishing group, and he and I are co-writing a book on writing a book, publishing it, and promoting it. And he's the guy who knows how to get things out there. He wrote a book on public speaking. He's actually the one who turned me on to Podmatch. But this book, he wrote it by himself. He self-published it, wrote it in 3 months, and all these things. I'm just like, yeah, whatever. I mean, if the material, it's solid stuff. It's not like it's not one of these for the ages type books. It's not, you know, like How to Win Friends and Influence People or An Element of Style. But he's sold more copies than I did of my traditionally published book. He's made more money than I have. And so he's really good at that approach, and also, again, promoting stuff. So he and I, like that book, we wrote for business purposes. And a lot of people are writing for business purposes. One of my clients, he's a pastor who does, he wants to teach people how to lead a church well, specifically with, if you have a church that's been around for a while, how can you help kind of light a fire underneath it instead of letting it stagnate? So he's writing to, first of all, pass on these principles, but also because he has a consulting thing that he does. So he wants to kind of build the reputation for that. Another one of my clients, she had a really awesome life, and she did some really cool stuff and like founded churches and all this. And she wants to be able to teach people about faith, and, you know, money for her is not an issue. She's doing just fine for herself. So a lot of people, though, they're saying the message is important to them. There's something that they're wanting to say that they feel like needs to be said. And so that is the most common thing I hear.
Yeah. And that's awesome. And that's something that we talk about in the podcast is, what is the message? And like, just like you said, it's going back to the why, like why you want to do this. And speaking of messages, so I just want to talk about also your book, Radically Normal. So Radically Normal, you don't have to live crazy to follow Jesus. And it has an amazing amount of stars, some great reviews. You know, so, for our audience, can you tell us about this book? It just sounds awesome.
Sure. So just as so I grew up in, I'm reluctant to use the term evangelical because it's been so tainted lately, But in short, an evangelical is kind of going to be midway in between like a fundamentalist who is like super conservative, and a more liberal Christian who's like anything goes. I mean, that's really speaking very broadly. I mean, but basically tries to take the Bible seriously, really loves Jesus, and trying to do the right thing. Tend to be more on the conservative side politically, but not always. But anyways, I'm writing within that world, that evangelical world, of people who take their faith seriously, really love Jesus. But what happens so often among Christians is that you get this mindset that if you're not like a full-time missionary to China, you're not really a good Christian.
Wow.
That if you just have like a day-to-day job, that's okay. Follow the 10 Commandments, tithe to your church, do all that stuff. Love your neighbor, but you're not really doing what you're supposed to be doing. And so that's a lot of what I was trying to do is talk about how you can be a Christian, a fully committed Christian within an everyday life. And this story, that this book was written, a lot of it was written while I was a bivocational pastor, which meant I was being a pastor, but also had a job, in this case at Starbucks. And so I told a lot of stories about Starbucks and the struggles I had being a pastor, now having a regular job, and things like that. But kind of so that's the purpose, is to help people help Christians to realize, how they can, love Jesus without being crazy. Mm-hmm. But kind of the theme of it is like, so I grew up, again, a good church, and in youth group, they would always talk about things like, the image you're given is like, there's this path of life that you're walking down, and on the side, there's this cliff. And this cliff is things like, sleeping with your girlfriend, listening to bad music, smoking, drinking, all that stuff. And you have to really avoid this cliff. And I did that. I was really good at avoiding that cliff. I was the good kid in church. Let me tell you, I did. Yeah. There's really no skeletons in my closet. It's embarrassing, frankly. But what they didn't tell me, because I don't think anyone really understood, is that on the other side of the path is another cliff of self-righteousness, of being judgmental, of thinking that you're better than other people. That's a cliff that I was cannonballing off of.
Oh, wow.
And so what I really try to do in this book is try to present this this balancing picture of, on one hand, don't do all the dumb stuff. I believe in Christian morals, so, by and large, that if you're selfish, if you're unforgiving, if you're, sleeping around, all these things are bad for our soul. They're bad, and they're bad for our life, Avoid those things by all means. But also being self-righteous, thinking that you're better than everyone else, that's also really bad for your soul. And one of the stories that Jesus tells, the parable of the prodigal son, which is, most people at least have heard that term. But in that story, you have the prodigal son who's going off and doing all the bad stuff. And by the end of the story, he's starving, and he's feeding pig slop and wishing he could eat the pig slop. And he comes back home to his father. His father forgives him. Well, he has an older brother who definitely is much more of this, the legalist, self-righteous side, who was like, you shouldn't forgive my brother because he was so evil, And Jesus is really telling the story not to the prodigal sons, but to the older brother, just because of this. Well, just speaking in terms of storycraft, this is something, you and your podcasters will understand. The story ends with the father saying something to the older brother, basically, why don't you come in and celebrate your younger brother returning home? But that's where the story ends. So we all know if you end a story early, you're really driving a point home. And you're basically saying, when the older son's given that question, but he doesn't answer it, you as the reader, as the listener, are being asked the question. So his listeners were the Pharisees, and he was asking them, all these other people they're coming into the kingdom of God, but you're not approving of it because of all the bad stuff they did. Why aren't you coming in and rejoicing and being part of the family? Which is all another way of saying that it's better to, the prodigal son, when he was starving, he knew his life was messed up. If you have someone who's losing their teeth because of crack cocaine or meth, they know their life's messed up. You have the old lady, or at church, who never smokes, never swears, but is just is self-righteous. She thinks she's fine, but biblically speaking, her soul is in just as much danger, but she doesn't know it. Mm-hmm. So that's a long ramble, but that's basically, I try to find ways to help Christians walk between that medium path. And it's funny, is one of my friends, he and his wife, they're PhD, post-PhD people working with lasers, and MRIs and all stuff in Atlanta, and she's a Christian, but he's not. He's kind of like agnostic Buddhist, but it's super cool guy. But he said, reading your book, it made sense to me. Some of the stuff, obviously I'm not tracking with, but it really made sense to me of avoiding these two extremes. So that's kind of the short version, I guess. It's as short as I can get it.
Yeah, that is awesome. I mean, I just based also on the reviews, and I mean, getting almost like 5 stars on Amazon, because that stuff, as a lot of people might come to understand, it can be difficult, but it speaks to the message. And I'm curious, so then at what point were you like, I need to write this book?
It's one of these things that I had this idea kind of fermenting in my head. So now I said that my novel started with this picture. Radically Normal started just with the title. I like that term, radically normal. And kind of knowing that I had the sense that we need to find kind of this middle way. And then now being a pastor, that means I preach a lot. And so some of these ideas start coming out in my sermons. Excuse me. But basically, a lot of us have been at this place where we keep on saying, we have something in our head and we keep on joking, yeah, I'll write about that, a book about that someday. I'll write a book about that someday. For me, the transition was when I read Stephen King's book on writing, which, probably most of your listeners have read. It's one of the best out there.
Yeah,
what he did for me was basically, he didn't make writing sound easy, far from it. When he talks about his nail with all the rejection slips on it, but he made it sound possible.
Yeah.
That basically writers aren't this special breed that if they're hand selected, writers are people who just go and finally get off their butt and do it. And that's where I kind of challenge myself to get off my butt and do it. And kind of, I don't know how much I should, I don't want to brag about this, but for me, initially I would go to Starbucks, I'd spend a little extra on a coffee drink. So I was kind of treating myself and start to write. And there's that, when you first start writing, there is that whole thing that it sounded so good in my head, but when I try to get on paper, it sounds like crap,
Yeah.
And so I do that for about half an hour, maybe, and then scroll around on Facebook and then finally give up. I did that a handful of times. And then I would also try to write back at home in the evenings, after my family was in bed, because my wife goes to bed relatively early. At this point, my girls are fairly young. And I had a big old bottle of Jim Beam, and I would drink, double or triple of that. And as I sipped on that, it quieted the voices that said, this is stupid. You can't write. What are you doing? What made you think you can write a book? And I just start writing without really caring. And then what would happen is I'd come back to, and I had fun. There's a power to routines, by the way. Sometimes having routines can kind of get you in a mood. So I had a playlist that I always used, and Little Lion Man by Mumford & Sons. My playlist always started with that song. So that song, when I heard the starting of that song, it said, "It is time to get to work." And then I'd drink my whiskey and I'd write away. And then I'd go and edit it the next day. And, a lot of it was terrible, but there was enough of it in there that was good that I kind of build off of. I'm not advocating, alcohol as a necessary tool for writing, but it certainly, the necessary tool is getting the voices to shut up and just write. So that again, that shitty first draft principle, you just have to get writing. And so that's what I did. I did that enough. You kind of hit a place where it feels like critical mass, like you feel like you're halfway done. And so, man, might as well continue. In reality, it's actually closer to 10% done, but I thought it was halfway done. And so at that point, once you get certain enough through project, you're kind of invested, that kind of provides a momentum. It's when you're getting started with any project that's the hardest. Did I answer your question there?
Oh yeah, totally. And going back to Stephen King's On Writing, yeah, the nail with all the rejection slips. I'm like, wow, that is brave, because I don't have the guts to look at like that pile just going up and up and up and up. I'm like, no, let's just put it away. That's what I would have done. So, I mean, you're so right about him just showing up consistently and creating that habit, as you said. And then of course, quieting that inner editor, which I think that is huge. And you're right. And there are different ways to do it, but really just trying to get words onto the page, which you did,
Yeah.
you know, and that is awesome. So I would like to talk about also, so you're a developmental editor. Were you your own developmental editor for your books, or did you go seeking out others? And how was that process?
So I did it all myself. When it comes the everything well, I use a lot of definitely beta readers. That's huge. But when it came to developing the material, I did it all myself. It is, again, we all have different strengths and weaknesses. Yeah. And I've done a lot of study on, say, like, dyslexia and all that. And basically, in short version, I'm really good at the big picture. Just the way my brain is wired, I can see the really big picture really well, find details I miss. I mean, to this day, if you show me a B or a D just by itself out of context, I'll have to think for a second to know which one it is. The fine details just are super tough. Between that and that whole process I talked about writing sermons, of going through all that information, I just developed the ability to kind of find order in things. Mm-hmm. That's just the way I'm wired. Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, there's a good book on being a developmental editor that I'm reading right now. I wish I could remember the name of it, but basically called How to Be a Developmental Editor. They can be very helpful. But as I read it, I realized most of the stuff it talked about, I'm innately doing.
Oh, cool.
But I'm a little weird in that most people who become developmental editors start as proofreaders and copy editors and work their way to being a developmental editor. I did the other way exactly. So it's more that I realized that this is something I'm capable of doing, is holding a ton of information in my head and then being able to organize it. So one of my current projects, this guy, this pastor, he paid someone $15,000 to ghostwrite his book. And on a sentence level, the writing was fine. But on the paragraph level, it was a mess. It's all over the place. Things would be repeated. He'd have stuff that really should be in this chapter was in that chapter. And I was trying to land the client. So I basically said, hey, give me 3 days with your book. And it was way too long. So the pastor knew that the book was way too long and it just didn't feel right. And so I said, I'll give me 3 days and I will cut the content by 25%. Because after skimming through, I knew I could do that. So that's what I did, which I don't really advocate working for free. Yeah. But in this situation, I thought it seemed like a good idea. And also I had the time at that point. Mm-hmm. So by doing that, I was able to cut all that and kind of rearrange it. And that's where he could really see the value of hiring me. And, unfortunately, I didn't get nearly the amount that he hired the original guy for, but I was able to go in there and just kind of go through and figure out, wait, this goes with this goes with this. And again, that's just, you have to know whether or not this is more for writing nonfiction, but you have to have a sense for whether or not you are the one who can kind of make sense of it, or whether you ask someone else. When it comes to story development editors, they have developmental editors for fiction as well, but that's a different thing. That's going to be more just a sense of whether or not a story works, knowing arcs and things like that. And for me, that's going to be even more intuitive and less, or more by feel and less by any sort of structure. Just like, yeah, this story just doesn't work, and I think this is why.
Yeah. That is awesome that you're talking about the different types of maybe like not mindsets, but some people are more attuned to proofreading. Some people are more attuned to developmental editing, and it's talking to your strengths. And, actually, so one thing that I hadn't mentioned, but you have been touching on it, is your dyslexia and ADHD. Mm-hmm. Now, I know some of our listeners, they are going through some other thing like similar to that or really similar to that. Can you talk about that? Like, when did you find that out? And also, how is that played into your writing? Because it also sounds like as if you're using it as like, hey, I'm going to use it as a strength and pop up this way.
Yeah, exactly. So when it came to ADHD, that I figured out, I'd say about 10, 15 years ago. I was probably 35, so about a little over 10 years ago, which is kind of weird to learn that so late in life. Kind of with the, because this is what I do. This seems normal. I mean, isn't everyone this way? Doesn't everyone panic when they have to put their shoes on? Because literally getting my shoes on can sending me into panic, because I get really flustered about which shoe and do I do this first or wait, and all these thoughts are going through my brain. but my doctor, I joked about it enough, and I basically got my leadership team. I'd have them give me annual reviews because I really believe in being in learning and growing. And they gave me some stuff that I finally said, you know what, I'm going to stop joking about this and just find out. So I talked to my doctor, and he said, well, there's not really, I can ask you questions, but there's no like medical blood test to see for ADHD. Tell you what, I'll give you a subscription. I'll give you some Ritalin, and if it calms you down, then you have it. If it sends you higher than a kite, then you don't. And I'll never forget that first time I took it and driving along the street, realizing I wasn't having to look at every person that walked past me, and to be in a, we went to this church, and they're like showing this, this marriage video thing. And about halfway through the day, as the Ritalin started to wear off, realizing, wait, I don't know what this room looks like. Because typically when I walk into a room, I check everything out. And oh, wait, weird. I now am feeling the chair on my fingertips again. These are all these things I would normally do that I didn't, I normally feel all these things, see all these things. And so that's been a challenge of just kind to learn how to work with my waves of the hyper focus that comes with ADHD. If I can get on a wave, man, I can ride that thing. At the same time, it has huge relational issues. ADHD is like can be a huge cause of divorce, quite frankly, and without people realizing it, because my focus is so much on everything that I have a hard time paying attention. So the number of things my wife tells me that I don't hear is huge. And it sounds funny. It makes for some good jokes, but the reality is if you felt like your spouse was never listening to you, it's actually not that much fun. So that's on a personal level, I've been working with that. But then in terms of writer, just trying to know my cycles. Like I have to, again, writing in the morning, knowing what works for me. The dyslexia is a much more recent thing where this was, less than a year ago. 6, 7, 8, 9 months ago, my youngest daughter, comes up to me and says, Dad, I think I have dyslexia. And I'm like, oh, okay. So I did some research. I'm like, crap, I think I have it. And it's actually massively hereditary. And because I always had dyslexia defined to me as like words moving around on a page, that doesn't happen to me. So I just never even dawned on me to even ask the question. And because I'm a good reader, I thought, I just, again, didn't even enter the question. Well, I'm actually not really a good reader. I'm a great skimmer. When I read a book, any book, whether reading Harry Potter or, Elements of Style or whatever, I'm probably only reading roughly a third of the words and picking up about 2/3 of the content and being quite happy to miss that other third. I don't care about it. And so that does mean, again, it's that ability to take in a lot of information, but miss a lot of fine details. So I've learned to work with it. I've learned tools. One of my most important tools is Microsoft Word products. Sorry, phone going off. I thought I had on Do Not Disturb, but apparently not. Microsoft Word products have a read aloud feature, and I have shortcutted on all of my programs. And so when I write an email, if it's an email of any sort of significance, like when I wrote to you, or a potential client, after I write it, I will listen to it because it's much easier to pick things up, listen to it than reading it. And the number of errors, I could either feel really stupid for the stuff that I miss, and I fight with that sometimes because the errors that I make are like, good Lord, you look like an ignoramus. But the reality is that's the way my brain works. It's going to miss stuff. So I most of the time I'm good with laughing at it. There it is. That's one of my most important. That's become one of my most important tools is using that read aloud feature. And there's some websites that do that without having to actually have Office 365. Anyways, there's a lot of stuff there. I don't know. Did that catch most of what you're asking?
Yeah. And even this in itself, I could see this being a whole other interview because you're talking about your strengths and you're talking about the obstacles that you have really faced or didn't even know were going on. And right. Yet you still use that to say, okay, maybe this is not super strong, but this is strong. And I'm going to go ahead and help people and use that to see the bigger picture, like you said, and get them organized and just really have that as a huge strength. I mean, that's fantastic, especially
Yeah.
because some of our writers, you know, they do feel like, oh, well, if I have this or I don't have that, then, you know, might as well not be writing. And that's not the case. Right?
No, there's such a thing to come to just appreciate. You know, it's definitely a biblical value of grace, biblical value, and that is grace, which is basically recognizing, you know, roughly God loves you no matter what, and that your value doesn't come from what you do, but from who you are, that you're a child of God. And so from that, on my best days, I can see my weaknesses and just be fine with it, you know, try and improve where I can, but you know, this is who I am. God still loves me. My wife and my kids still love me, and I'm just going to do my best. And I'm going to, and this is the other really important thing, find people who can shore up what I can't do. That's just so crucial, that you can be asking for people to make up what you're not good in. You just have to be able to do that, you know, and for that you have to need to know what you're not good in, and you have to be honest enough, and that takes a certain level of humility, but also takes a great deal of strength to say, yeah, I suck at this. Can you help me? And if you can't do that, gosh, I know writers who don't want anyone to read their stuff before, you know, but they think you're going to submit it to an agent, huh? No, everything I write goes through other people for multiple reasons, you know. You have to bring other people in. That takes humility. And like, again, just back to the main point, you know where you're weak at. Don't freak out about it. Find people who can help you there. You know, it works great. And that now is a lot of what ghostwriting is. You know, I've spent 15 years honing my ability to write, you know, between sermon writing, book writing, and all these things. I've spent all this time, and I can research the crap out of anything. I mean, my bookshelf has so many books about anything that whatever happens to be of interest to me. So I spent a lot of time developing this. Now you take someone who like, you know, a pastor, spent all these years being a pastor, or a politician or athlete, an actor who've spent all this time honing that craft. Well, they have a story to tell. They maybe have some great business principles, whatever it is, but they're not great writers. So there's nothing wrong with that. There can be like this sense like, well, you should write your own books. Well, no, I've spent a lot of time honing this craft. And it's kind of silly for someone else to think that they can just pick up a pen or sit down at a computer and do what I do, because I spent this time doing it. So at its best, ghostwriting is this great partnership where it's like, you have the skills, you have the experience, you've lived this life, you have these principles, but now I have this ability to write, and I also know how to interview, how to pull things out of you. I know how to craft stories. I know where to use stories and which stories work best to illustrate which things. So let's work together. And so that's kind of the ideal ghostwriting situation.
Yeah.
And editing. Yeah.
That is beautifully said. I mean, it's beautifully said because you're talking about your value is outside of that, you know, like you're a child of God, you are valuable. And then saying, okay, now that you know that, go ahead and you can have the humility to say, and the vulnerability to saying, you know, I need help with this. And that is fantastic. Yeah. And it sounds like you as a developmental editor and ghostwriter, you are, you know, taking care of the story. You will have that love of story. You can totally tell that you're like, let me take, you know, this person's, you know, quote unquote baby, and I'm going to take care of it and help you tell this the best way that we can. That is,
I just want to, I want to make people shine. I mean, that really is what it is. You know, that's,
amazing. And I could totally tell. Oh my gosh. You know, this has been amazing. And to be honest, I'm going to tell you, look, I had a list of notes that we hardly touched. So hopefully we can meet together again soon, because I think this was fantastic. You know, and so for our listeners, you know, go ahead and tell us, where can they find you? Where can they find your services too?
Absolutely. So my website is Josh Kelley, and that's JoshKelley. There's a second E on the end. That's what always messes people up. JoshKelley.inc, INK, like the stuff you write with. If you do .com, you'll get Josh Kelley, the musician. I don't play any instruments. You don't want me doing that. But so JoshKelley.inc, again, INK. And if you go there, you can find out a little bit more about me. And something that I enjoy doing that offers like a free coaching session, because I've discovered this ability to very quickly be able to ascertain what people are doing, what is it, and basically give them some really good content, add some value very quickly. And, you know, if I'm able to help them just, you know, like half an hour, 45 minutes and give them something good to go with, and that's it, fine, I'm great with that. but also that may uncover some ways where like we can work together. Like if you're needing, you know, a developmental editor, like you have all this information, but you just know it's not fitting together. And I do everything from like a full development editing where it's like a per word charge, and you know I go through the whole thing, or do coaching, like hire me at, you know, just kind of on a shop rate basis. Like, okay, let's, you know, do X amount of hours a month. I'll kind of work with you, and I'll coach you through some stuff. I'll give you some assignments. You bring it back to me. I'm a line editor as well, which means I do very good at crafting, you know, crafting words. So I might be able to show you some tricks. Like, hey, you keep on start with having this phrase at the beginning of statements. Get rid of that, or you know, all these things that you write enough, and you just get used to doing it. So there's a lot of ways I can help people at kind of a lot of variety of price points. But if nothing else, there is, you know, just that free coaching session, and you know, seriously, no obligation, but I will let you know, hey, here's how I might be able to help you. But if nothing else, you might gain something new from it. So that's, yeah, so joshkelley.inc. That's gonna be the best way to get a hold of me.
That is excellent. And for all our listeners, yeah, you know, go and take advantage of this, because to have a professional writer, you know, share their knowledge, share their expertise, and not just that, but to come from where you're coming from as a developmental editor and the ghostwriter. I mean, that's a unique perspective. So everybody's listening, jump in there. So that's joshkelley.inc. You will find him there. And Josh, this has been amazing. Thank you so much for joining us. So we'll close out here. Yeah. And you know,
so much for, yeah, it's a lot of fun for me to talk about this stuff. I really appreciate the opportunity.
Excellent. Excellent. All right, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. Josh, thanks again. And hopefully we're going to see you again really soon. So thanks.